to be honest, I'd seen a lot of films about the migration, but I'd never given much thought about making one myself. I think a lot of filmmakers would dream to go and make a film about the migration, although it wasn't something on my immediate agenda. But John Varty called me out of the blue and asked me to join him on one of his filming expeditions to the Mara. And that's how I got into it. It wasn't as if I sat down and decided to go and do it. I went along as camera to begin with. We know the migration's a funny thing because each migration is different, and this was also my first migration. So I tended to think it was a typical migration, but from what I learned, that there is no typical migration. Herds came and went on a daily basis. Some days the Mara was full of animals. Other days it was empty. It was almost like a ghost town. It ebbed and changed depending on the weather and the climate. I went initially for about 6 weeks, and I ended up staying 3 months, and that was the duration of that migration in 1998. However, migrations can come and go in a day. That entire migration can be there just for 24 hours. It might not even arrive, and it can be anything up to 3 or 4 months, and anything in between. I was so blown away by the migration. It's such a powerful piece of nature that takes place at a certain time of year. It is so big, so immense, and it's so exciting. And all I really wanted to do was try and give a sense of, I wanted to try and convey a sense of what I was experiencing there during the migration. And it's very hard to do that because film just captures tiny fragments of the 3 months. Ambush in Paradise is a 52-minute docu, 1 hour. You're looking at 1 hour of material out of 100 hours that was shot, out of 1,000 hours that was lived. Not necessarily all the best, not necessarily the most exciting or the most dramatic, but certainly the best to tell the story the way it was. And it's very hard to try and pull that emotion through in a film, but that was my goal, was try and drive the emotions that I had, which were a sense of excitement and wonder and awe. But one thing I did notice was that most script writers or producers or directors try and break it into simplistic terms. Any film. They try and take a complex subject and make it linear and make it as simple as possible so that it's not overly taxing to the viewer or disruptive or disjointed. Because the migration, when you look at the migration in films, they generally say the wildebeest arrive, the zebra come first, then the wildebeest, and then they cross the river, and then they get chomped by the crocs, and then they survive the battle of the lions, then they graze, and then they turn around and they go home. Well, that is true, but it's not really what happens. What happens is there's this ebb and flow continually backwards and forwards across the Mara River. There's these dramas going on all over the place. Some animals have crossed, others haven't. Some cross backwards and forwards. Some stay on one side of the river, then come back the next day. Some animals cross multiple times, and I often sat at the crossings wondering, why? Why would you do this? Why would you put yourself at this risk? And, you know, you can't think for animals. People talk about a herd instinct. They talk about getting caught up in the masses or the hysteria of what's happening, and that probably does take place. And I think with Ambush in Paradise, I tried to reflect a little bit of the chaoticness. There are more than one crossing. I don't show it as a linear film. I try to show that there's confusion where animals cross backwards and forwards, where the migration comes and goes and comes back again and goes again. And I try to be more, not necessarily honest, but try and reflect it a little bit more the way it is. Because it just doesn't arrive 1 million animals and then 1 million animals leave. It just doesn't work that way. The cut and the pace, I wanted to build an energy that reflected the migration. Where it was hectic, it needed to be fast and pacey. And there are times where 500,000 wildebeest could be grazing on the plains, and an hour later, those plains are vacant, empty, quiet, still. And the edit should reflect that. When Rexon and I, the driver, got malaria, before we realized it was malaria, we were obviously quite run down, and we couldn't understand why we weren't operating so well during the day. And my tracker, Carino, suggested we go and see Dr. John. Oh, wonderful, a doctor. So we go off, and we find the clinic, a very small little brick clinic, and Dr. John was inside, who spoke wonderful English, and informed me that he had been taught by missionaries. It's when I realized that Dr. John wasn't an official doctor. He had just been taught. And when he diagnosed that I had malaria, I was dubious, especially when he wanted to treat me with chloroquine, which I knew from South Africa was the strain is resistant to, and you can die within a couple of days of taking chloroquine. So we spent about 10 days flat on our back in camp. And that was pretty strange, being so far from home in an isolated place, and we really were isolated, being self-medicated. So I was a bit nervous, but I had no choice. So I took the chloroquine with Rexon, and obviously we survived the ordeal, and later struck up quite a relationship with Dr. John, who I've subsequently come to believe is probably one of the finest doctors I've ever met. He might not be a certified doctor, but he certainly knows his business on these strong diseases, these often fatal diseases, and that's all he treats. I don't think he treats coughs and colds and aches and pains. It's the limbs that have been bitten off by lions, it's the malaria, it's the really chronic things that he deals with, and he's right on the front line there. So he was a great find. I've often thought about this before. I've filmed fairly gruesome sequences, and there's kind of a procedure that takes place once your eye hits the camera. You are thinking about light, exposure, focus, composition, wide shot, medium shot, tight shot, build the story, what's happening here. You're thinking so fast that actually you tend to miss the spectacle. And you see it in such isolation that whenever I've seen kills, when I haven't been filming, I've been far more moved by it than I have looking through a lens. Even though the lens brings you closer and gives you far greater detail, I think possibly because you're working, you don't allow yourself an attachment, and I've never been affected by anything I've ever seen. It's once I switch the camera off and assess later what I just filmed, I often get quite a rush of emotions that come to me, and they can be hard to deal with. The drowning at the end of Ambush of Paradise was the first mass drowning I'd ever seen. It took place in about 40 minutes. And those 40 minutes flew by in a matter of seconds to me. But those drownings disturbed me for days afterwards. At night when I slept, all I could hear was those animals bleating, flashes of those animals coming back to me. It was immensely disturbing. Not while I was filming it. It's after the fact. Being a vegetarian and staying in a camp, in a Masai camp, makes life difficult, because one of the things they want to give you is blood and milk as a traditional drink, and it's almost like a welcome thing. And when you refuse to drink it, they're highly offended. So we didn't get off to a great start. However, being with John was, I think, about the only saving grace, because he explained to them that, I was a weird vegetarian that only ate vegetables, which was no end of amusement to the Masai. For them, nothing better than eating an entire goat at one sitting. In fact, they go to great lengths to tell you how much they can consume meat-wise in one sitting. They eat until they're literally bloated, like lions would do. And they seem to see themselves being very similar. They're vast consumers of meat. And I don't think a vegetable passes their lips. So the food side of the camp was interesting. I had a Masai cook there who hadn't the foggiest about cooking for a vegetarian. I did get a lot of Marmite sandwiches, but the first day, I think half a jar of Marmite onto two slices of bread. There was no idea. It was interesting, and over 3 months I lost quite a bit of weight. I think I should actually go there now. In the Mara, you film from vehicles, so you need a driver, a spotter, and a cameraman. So that's a crew of 1. And John was there as well with his own crew. So there were 6 of us, 2 vehicles that filmed. Although John came and went at times, but I was there for the whole duration of that particular migration. Other people work differently. The cameraman is the driver and whatnot. But we found at LONDOLOZI, the Maasai are brilliant spotters. They know the land, they know the area, and you just have to invest in them for their knowledge, if nothing else. They'll really get you to where the action is, and obviously the action's what the migration's about. Laveria's was training to be a cameraman on this shoot, and when John left, he took over the second vehicle, and he has a formal education and can speak very good English, which was, in fact, I don't think I could have survived that shoot without his assistance. Lekaken is an elder and speaks only Maasai and very little Swahili. Although I used to be fluent in Swahili in my childhood, I'd kind of forgotten it. I hadn't used it for 20 years. And when I used it, I realized it was actually dated. Over the time of the shoot, my Swahili came back to me in that I was able to communicate to the Maasai that can speak Swahili. And there's not a lot of them that can. They mostly speak Maasai. So communication was one of the hardest things. And I had Carino as my tracker, a respected elder, old tracker who's been on many raiding parties into Tanzania for cattle and whatever the Maasai do, and bears the scars to tell, but as a tracker, absolutely phenomenal. In fact, the one day he said, cheetah, Duma, pointed into the distance. We stopped the vehicle and I looked and I couldn't see. I asked where, pointed again in the distance, still couldn't see it, picked up binoculars, couldn't pick it up. And the Mara's open. It's not like it's a wooded area. We're talking open plains here. I looked, I couldn't see it. Gave the binoculars to Rexon, the driver. He's a Shangaan from South Africa. He looked, he couldn't pick it up. So I said to Rexon, just zero the clock counter here and let's just drive until we can see it. And we drove 3.6 kilometers before I saw it in a straight line. And there it was sitting in rocks. Now, I do know that if an animal sits still, it's very hard to see, and often it's easier for the person that spotted the animal. However, I know at 3.6 kilometers, I would not see that animal. They've got phenomenal eyesight. But it's not just their eyesight, it's the knowledge of the animals that comes with it. And you can't operate in those kind of environments without that local knowledge. They're fabulous. And our communication got better, and we got less frustrated with each other. Karina, I think, wanted to stick a spear in me a good 20 times because I wasn't fast enough. In fact, if I didn't get the shot, the first thing he wanted to know was, did I get the shot? If I didn't get the shot, he was beside himself. He was so upset if I missed the shot. And you don't always get the shot. You know, the cheetah runs out of frame, runs behind a bush, hits behind a vehicle. Anything takes place. But he was often visibly more upset than I was, and I was pretty devastated by missing it, because there's nothing like a cameraman missing the shot. But he was devastated. And between us, we kind of egged ourselves along, and we kept our spirits up. He's a great guy. The music, I was very certain I wanted the indigenous local people. I didn't want too much of a Western sound to the track. And for that reason, I involved the Masai people. I believe if anybody owns a migration, it's the Masai. We try to use that rhythm, those chants, as recurring chants throughout, to sort of give a sense of the land, the place, and the people, not necessarily just the migration. And though the Maasai don't come into this film, they are integral to the migration. I mean, they've lived for thousands of years with these animals. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to bring the Maasai chanting into the program. I was actually shocked at the number of tourists and camera crews in the Masai Mara. We wanted to film lions, but there were crews that were, film crews that were following the lions quite intensively. In fact, they followed them so intensively that they altered their hunting behavior, that the lions stopped hunting in the daytime and switched to nocturnal hunting. And in the Mara, you're not allowed to film at night. You have to get a special permit, and it's very hard to do that. So the result was that none of us were able to get decent lion hunts in that particular shoot. The animals reacted to the tourists and the cameramen in different ways. And it dawned on me how we as filmmakers and as tourists are affecting behavioral habits of animals. And one example is, one morning we'd picked up a cheetah, and we picked her up at early light, and she was resting up. She had 3 cubs with her, 18-month-old cubs. And the first tourist vehicles came through, and what I realized rapidly was that they didn't look for game, they looked for film cars. And when they see a film car, they know, well, they're definitely sitting with a predator. So the driver would drive straight up to you and say, what have you got here? And soon one vehicle attracted another, and you could have 15 to 20 vehicles around this cheetah. And the cheetah would just lie there, and the tourists would be there for about an hour, photographing, chatting, talking, doing whatever they were doing. And then they would go for their breakfast. And when they started up the vehicles and drove off, the cheetah literally just sat up and started hunting. And we got a great hit. And I thought afterwards, was that coincidental? And I started to pay attention to this, and I realized that the cheetah knew the cycles of the tourists. So they would give them their 15 minutes with the camera, and when they left for their lunch or their breakfast break, they would get up and go and hit. And it fascinated me. There were also other animals that were not so fortunate, that tourists were around and affected the hunt because they didn't go, or they started to hunt while the tourists were there. And they would surround the animal and follow them. Now, the gazelle or the wildebeest or whatever the prey animal was, they would just see a large group of cars and they know predator, so they just give you a wide berth. A lot of the crews are great, and some of them have their own agenda. and they tend to think that they own the migration because they go there on a regular basis. We're dealing with human beings, so there's all kinds of people, but mostly people are decent. We were at this crossing. There was it was a large zebra crossing mixed with wildebeest, and a woman on the other side of the river wanted better shots, climbed out of the vehicle, down the side of the river, and started taking photos of the animals, and she blocked the path of these wildebeest. That the animals were turning around, were being confused, moving down the river where it was deeper, where there was rocks, and the crocodile started hammering them. And she caused the death of multiple animals without even realizing it, just to get a better shot. Filmmakers have created such expectations by showing kill after kill, hit after hit, spectacular footage of the migration, that when people come and they don't see it, they're disappointed. And they want to see blood. They want to see it. And yet, often when they see it, they're repulsed. So it's an enigma in itself. And although it is something that people should see, I would like to see the tourism part of it controlled better, that you don't have this mass hysteria there. LONDOLOZI uses Arriflex Super 16mm film cameras. We've used them for 20 odd years. Nothing much has changed about them. The advantage is that you can shoot them at high speed, at 120 frames a second, where video, up until the advent of HD, you couldn't do that. The new Panasonics you can. However, we were still using film then, and it requires a different way of managing your process. You get a 9-minute roll, and if you're going out after a cheetah that's hunting, you know you've got 9 minutes in the can or in the mag. And if you start blowing film away on the stalk and the pre-hunt and everything like that, you can shoot 3 minutes very quickly, which just leaves you nothing, especially when you go to 120 frames a second, because 120 frames a second will take a 9-minute can down to 3 minutes of equivalent film time. So you start to get a little bit precious about what you shoot and what you don't. And it's one of the frustrations with film, because some of the crews filming were using video, and they were able to just burn tape all the time and pick up all kinds of stuff. But there's something nice about film that forces a discipline, and it makes you read the animal or the situation probably a little more intensely than a videotape cameraman might. You have to be more alert to things that go on. So we used film. I think we shot something like 117 rolls in those 3 months. We also use Zeiss lenses, 10 to 120 lenses, and they are sort of medium to wide angle lenses, and 300mm lens, Canon 300mm, and a doubler which takes it up to 600mm. Now, for those that are interested, the Super 16, it being a 16mm plate, those lenses are designed for 35mm use, and the 16mm is half of 35mm, so your image size is doubled effectively. So you'd be working around about 1,200mm lens, certainly on the chases with cheetah and in places you can't get to. And definitely that's where the Super 16 exceeded videotape expectations. The other crews had to get closer and often, interrupted things.